Areva, our next case, a Montana man who was charged with 64 child sex crimes, has entered into a plea deal. Now, this plea deal means that he may never spend any more time in prison because they're using time served pretty much to fill out his sentence. He's receiving a 1-year deferred prison sentence. 51-year-old William Edward Miller Jr. was arrested in February of 2019 after a 14-year-old high school student accused him of raping her at her home the year before. And she also said as part of that he allowed an 11-year-old boy to rape her as he watched. This was a separate encounter. Explain to me how it is possible that something so heinous can end up with, oh, you know what? We're going to get rid of all those other charges and you can just go home now.
Yeah, this is really an outrageous case, Anna. And it's kind of confusing because there are a lot of parts to the case. So there's the allegation of rape of the 14-year-old girl who says that this defendant raped her and that he allowed another 11-year-old boy to rape her as well. And then there are allegations of child pornography, that his telephone, his computer were, just full of pornographic images of minors. And we know there's also a charge of a 17-year-old who's now a 19-year-old who he since has married, that there were some charges related to, a sexual misconduct against her when she was a minor. She now is testifying in favor of and is accusing the prosecutors in this case of overreaching and is saying he's a good man and that he shouldn't be charged with anything. There's also some allegations in this case that he was making phone calls to her, the 17-year-old, who's now the 19-year-old, trying to get her to go to his home so that she could destroy some of these pornographic images that were on his computer. So it's not clear that he is being charged with this rape, which would be a very serious charge for which you would expect to see, a much more severe penalty beyond the 1 year that's at this point looks like it's going to be a deferred 1-year sentence. So not clear from the evidence that's been reported out if the charges have been reduced to this amount because of the lack of evidence to support the pornography that apparently was found eventually by the police on his computer, or if there's not enough evidence to support the rape charge being made by the 14-year-old.
Well, clearly the prosecutors must have felt that they could not get a conviction if they're willing to go from 64 counts to about 1 or 2 counts. It just doesn't fly. And just to give everyone a little bit of background, okay, let's go through the alleged rape, and then we can explain how the next search and the pornography and the bestiality and all the other stuff plays in here. All right, so the girl said that William Miller used to visit the family's house regularly, okay, and that she always felt very uncomfortable around him. She said that in March of 2018, that she was alone in her bedroom with her door locked, and she claims that William Miller picked the lock and then entered her bedroom and then relocked the door from the inside. She claims that he took off his clothes, covered her mouth, and he raped her. This is all from a public affidavit. The girl also claimed that sometime in the following month, which would have been in April of 2018, Miller allowed an 11-year-old boy to rape her. According to court documents, the girl told her father, and he asked her to put all these details into writing, and for whatever reason, she didn't want to do that. So he asked her, could she tell her story, and he would videotape it. So I guess the father videotaped it, and then there was a follow-up forensic investigation. And in that forensic investigation, the girl explained to the police that Miller was always hitting on her and always using really graphic language about what he wanted to do to her. And apparently when this incident took place, the one where she was allegedly raped, her mother and her sister were both home. Now, what's also interesting is, according to the court records, when she told a teacher what had happened, it was the teacher who then contacted police. So this is the part I think where things get very confusing. It's the teachers and the school, they're mandatory reporters. They contact the police, right? The father, she supposedly tells the father tries to get this all in writing, and this guy, the alleged attacker, is a friend of the father's. So
yeah, I was gonna say right there for me, Anna, the story gets crazy. Why is the father asking the daughter to write out a rape? So if you are a 14-year-old and you say, Dad, someone has touched me, someone has raped me, is your first instinct really for your daughter to write out an affidavit, to write out a statement? I don't understand what went wrong, or why didn't we see this father immediately contact the police? And then this he concocts this whole investigation himself. He videotapes his daughter. I mean, how humiliating is that for your dad to, I don't know, he's playing like junior detective here, junior PI with this videotaping, with this statement that he wants her to write. I just find that incredibly bizarre. Maybe it's a friendship. And we do see this, unfortunately, in cases involving minors. We've seen cases where minors are, they accuse an adult of sexual assault or rape, and they're not believed. And even their own parents oftentimes won't believe them. And maybe that was what was going on in the mind of her dad, because this is very unusual for him to ask her to write it out.
Isn't that bizarre?
Like, why, Dad? I just told you the most horrible thing on the planet has happened to me. And your response is, put it in writing?
Yeah. And she refused, Well,
kudos to her for refusing to do that. But
yeah, that I have to admit that part is very strange. And by the time it finally got to the forensic investigators, so they also talked to that 11-year-old boy. And the 11-year-old boy was interviewed, and he denied that it happened. And the police wrote in their reports that they believed that the boy's answers had been rehearsed. They sensed, it was their gut, that the boy was not being truthful about what was going on. Now, and the other thing that the girl said was, she told the police that the reason she didn't, I guess she went to her dad, but she didn't go to the police immediately, was because Miller had threatened to kill her and her family. Which, when an abuser tries to continue to abuse or abuse a minor, and this is a control issue, the minor is generally really frightened that they are going to hurt the family.
But when you think about it, Anna, she did exactly what we would want a 14-year-old to do. She told her parents and she told her teacher. I mean, you really wouldn't expect a 14-year-old to pick up the phone and call 911 or to somehow try to get, to the police department. That's just not, the thinking of a 14-year-old. She did exactly what we would want a teenager to do in this situation, is to tell the people who she believes are entrusted to take care of her and to protect her, your parents and your teachers. And the fact that, the parents, in this case, and again, I say the dad failed her, because rather than going immediately to the police, he gets involved in this really ridiculous investigation himself. And the 11-year-old, again, he's a kid. I'm not surprised that his comments seemed rehearsed, because he, faces, even though he's a minor, he also could be facing, charges. He could be facing, being put into juvenile detention. So, somebody, maybe Miller, got to him to say, hey, this is what you need to do. This is the story you need to tell. I don't think that linkage was made, though. The police don't really say who is the person that was, rehearsing the 11-year-old's response.
So at this point in the case, police believe that they have enough to arrest him, and they do. They arrest him and they set bond at $200,000, and he is charged with the rape charges. Okay, so now the case actually against him gets stronger, if you will, because then in August of 2019, state prosecutors filed an extra 64 counts of sexual abuse of children against William after investigators allegedly found images of child pornography and bestiality on his phone, on his laptop. More than 6,000 images of bestiality. Oh my God, how depraved. So police managed to get this search warrant. It's very interesting how they did this when they got the search warrant to go into his house. Two things were happening. You know, when you're sitting in a jail and you're making phone calls or people are visiting you, always remember they're being recorded.
They're listening. Yes.
They're listening.
Yes.
So apparently he told a bunch of his friends and family, hey, do me a favor, go to my house. I got some photos. You have to destroy them. Right? Okay. So already the police are like, ding, 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 ding. Something's going on. He's got something at the house we need to see. Separate and in addition to that was this woman who was actually a girl at the time who police got a tip that she was headed to the home and that she wanted they thought she was going to destroy evidence. And in a way, she claims that, yes, she was, only because they were pictures of her. And she didn't want the police to get them. And she was a minor and she was engaged in sexual acts. And so police managed to intervene before she gets to destroy them. Okay. And Miller's mother is still living at his house. And she's like following the cops around as they're trying to get things. And she's like, and they're taking this and they're looking at this. You know, you can imagine.
And she's talking to the girl on the phone. This is what's so crazy and bizarre about this. So,
okay, right? Okay, so everyone's trying to protect this guy. All the women in his life apparently are trying to protect him. But they do seize the items, and they do confirm that there were pictures of child pornography, bestiality.
Well, remember, they didn't have a search warrant at that time for the computer. They had to store the computer at the police department and wait until they could get a warrant to actually go on and then just, to discover all of this, depraved material, pornography on the computer.
Now, do you think so the cops said that the reason they took the laptop, they did not have the search warrant. Is there a different kind of a search warrant, a digital kind of a search warrant to enter into computers and phones?
Well, the search warrant has to be based on, what do they have probable cause for? So at this point, they didn't have probable cause to know that there could be, this pornographic material on that computer. So the search warrant, they had to go and build a case for why they should be allowed to look at that computer. So then they did that, I'm sure, by listening to the phone calls that he's making and perhaps even interviewing the young woman who is now the wife, who was actually sent to the house to retrieve these items. So oftentimes police will go into a home because they have a search warrant to search your home. And now they've got to get an additional search warrant to go into your laptop or to your cell phone, because they've got to establish that there's evidence or there's the likelihood of evidence to support a crime that's actually being stored on one of those devices.
So they took the computer into custody, but presumably until they got the search warrant, they couldn't open it,
search it. Yes, absolutely.
Which is interesting. And I have no idea what happened during this plea deal, right? And you can certainly shed some light on it. So, I mean, how is it that you go from a case that seems almost bulletproof? Okay, we get the he said, she said, and we don't know what kind of forensic testing there was on the girl. We don't know any of that. But what I'm saying is, it seems like there's a lot of evidence on one side. So how does it go from 64 to nothing or one?
Yeah, a couple of things. And again, we don't have the records to show this, so I'm going to just surmise based on my experience. You have a 14-year-old girl. Obviously, he's not being charged. The rape charge has been reduced, so that's been a part of this plea deal. So he's no longer facing these serious rape charges. So either in interviewing the 14-year-old, the police found her statements to have some holes in it. Maybe she wasn't as credible of a witness. Maybe, the sequence of events didn't line up. The 11-year-old, although rehearsed, again, perhaps their stories, they could not corroborate the testimony and the statements of the 14-year-old girl. So something went wrong in terms of the ability to establish and to prove the very serious rape charges involving Miller and the 14-year-old girl and the 11-year-old. When I look at the 64 charges that stem from what was found on that computer, again, I question whether there were issues with the issuance of that warrant. Were there problems with that warrant that caused them to not be able to, use to submit into court, into evidence, the 6,000 images that they actually found stored on the laptop and the cell phone. And that's common. Unfortunately, even when there is the evidence there, the question becomes, how was the evidence obtained? And if there's not the proper, procedures aren't followed that protect the constitutional rights that Miller has, he, still has his constitutional rights at this point. And if there was something wrong with that search, if there was something wrong with that seizure, then that evidence wouldn't be admissible and they would have no choice but to, reduce the charges or to enter in some kind of plea deal, which is what we saw in this case. Because one of the statements I read from the judge, seemingly expressing how horrendous the case was, but that she had no choice, in terms of the sentencing that she was handing down. So, and we see that a lot, in cases where evidence appears to be really clearly establishing a crime against a particular, defendant or person that's been charged, but then there's something wrong with the way that evidence was gathered.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that a crime was not committed.
Oh, absolutely not. It doesn't mean that that person is innocent. I mean, it doesn't mean that this 14-year-old girl wasn't raped. Doesn't mean that Miller didn't do it. Doesn't mean that the 11-year-old didn't do it. Doesn't mean that those 6,000 images don't exist on that computer. Again, it just comes down to the process and the procedure. And in our criminal justice system, if that procedure for gathering that evidence is somehow, if a step is missing, or if the police did not follow, the constitutional way in which evidence has to be gathered, then it can mean the whole case, in some instances, has to be dismissed.
So he eventually struck a plea deal with the prosecutors, and what he pleaded guilty to is one count of sexual abuse of children, and he pleaded guilty to unsworn falsification to authorities. The other 63 charges dropped. So he was sentenced to 6 months in the county detention center with credit for the 384 days, which he had already served. Therefore, that's why he's walking, because it's a deferred sentence. He's getting credit for the time he was in prison. In jail. So the judge, Elizabeth Best, sentenced him to that 1-year deferred sentence. And she also ordered him to complete sex offender treatment in the community. And as you said, she had a lot to say. And here is her quote. She emphasized that she could only sentence Miller on the 2 charges before her, and she could not consider the previous charges that had been filed against her. And this is what she said, quote, "I think it's real easy, and it's easy for the courts from the bench to use these offenses as an opportunity to grandstand and to make statements for the newspaper and TV. They're very, very loaded charges. They're very difficult charges to defend against." So, I think what she's basically saying is my hands were tied.
Yeah, absolutely. In a nutshell, I can't really do anything about those charges that were dropped. The law doesn't allow me to punish him for those charges that were dropped. And not only that, I have to follow the sentencing guidelines for the charges that remain. And unfortunately, the consequences for the charges that remain are pretty low. They're pretty restrictive. So here's a guy that I'm imagining this female judge is sitting here saying, here's a predator, a sexual predator. And I've got to let him basically walk, a proverbial walk is what this guy is getting. A slap on the wrist, is really what he's getting.
And so, the woman who was really pivotal in a lot of this was the woman who would have been underage that he had photos of, who he had married 3 months earlier, which is, I'm a little confused here when exactly he married her, because the photos were taken.
Because it's not clear how old she was.
She was 17 and now she's 19. Okay. And she claimed those photos were of her. Now, the age of consent for sex in Montana is 16. Here's what's interesting. So she was of age to have sex with him. However, in Montana, in order to be photographed, anyone under the age of 18 photographed in any suggestive or sexual nature is considered pornography. Now, how confusing is that?
Well, and then let's add another layer. She said she took the pictures. So she's also claiming that he did not take the pictures, that she had body image issues, and that she took the pictures as a way of expressing her femininity, her beauty, and dealing with her body image issues. And this is the wife now, because she's, legally married to him, who's, making statements in support of him. So 17-year-old having sex, obviously, with a 50-year-old man. Somebody's taking nude pictures of her. They end up, on this electronic device. And now 2 years later, she's saying he's a great guy and that the system is being too hard on him.
Areva, because she is now his wife, could she testify against him? They couldn't force her, right?
Yeah, they're not going to force her to testify against him. Very difficult. There are some exceptions to the marital privilege in some situations where a wife can be. I don't see anything in this case based on what we have before us that would support that. But I think what she is doing is supporting him by, taking responsibility for these photographs, saying that she took them, giving us a reason, saying, oh, no, this isn't pornography. This is just a young woman grappling with, body image issues. And this is a guy that is not the beast that you all are describing, but this is my loving husband.
In fact,
I feel bad for this teenage girl, and I wonder, where are her parents? We're talking about parents,
Well, this is what she told the judge, Areva. William is a kind, compassionate, empathetic man. Never has he manipulated me or controlled me, she said. I ask that we be free of this charge. I feel that we have suffered enough, and I am not a victim of my husband. Yes. I'm sure all of this continued to complicate this case, right? So it looks, as we continue to, as this evolves, like the case is falling apart, Just
the witnesses are falling apart. There's something going on with the 14-year-old. We already know, the police thought the 11-year-old was rehearsed. And now the wife is saying this is a loving, kind husband who should be let go. And again, we have the judge, her statement, very veiled statement, but clearly one of frustration about having to give, a pretty light sentence to Miller.
And what's also interesting about his sentence is that if he remains, while he's on probation, if he doesn't commit any crimes at all, doesn't get into any trouble, then they're actually going to remove him from the sex offender registry. Yeah. I am like,
mind-boggling.
What? Yeah. I mean, the case is just crumbling. So Miller, the man accused here, he had a chance to say something to the judge. And this is what he said. He said, all of this that happened to me, my wife, our kid, has just been a tragic thing. It's destroyed our lives and we're suffering. I've served time in jail for stuff that I didn't even do. Mm-hmm. And he also told the judge, I'm a good person, but this is my favorite part. He says, I'm a good person, but I've had really bad luck. I would say, no, you've had some very good luck at the end because everything has been dropped against you. Yeah, you're free to go, buddy.
You're the luckiest man on earth because, but for the weaknesses, the issues in this case, this is a guy that you can imagine he's 51 now, maybe life, for him, a 20-year stint could be life for him. So, yeah, I think he has that backwards. He's not unlucky. He's very lucky.
Agreed.